Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
I was very much involved at Menwith Hill, which is the largest American spy base in the world. 2 Ministry of Defence police officers drove over and asked me if I had heard any of the news that had been going on that morning, early afternoon. I hadn't. And they asked me, what did I think it meant?
I said to myself, I remember, and later to others, someone is going to pay for this. And it's not going to be the people who carried it out necessarily, but others.
A few hours later and started getting calls and texts from friends saying, oh my God, do you think it's possibly Muslims behind it? And feeling really quite sick to your stomach, thinking that someone could, hijack your religion and use it in that way, and misinterpret it for such sort of violent ends.
I think very quickly, certainly on the day, myself and others started thinking about the implications of this and the likelihood that the US administration of George Bush would react in a way that would spread war around the world.
From the very first, it was obvious that this was a huge event and that nothing would ever quite be the same after it. Well, I think the proximate causes, the most immediate causes, were the first Gulf War. This was the point at which there was a breach between Osama bin Laden and America. We have to remember that Osama bin Laden was funded by and sustained by, armed by America during the conflict with the Soviets in Afghanistan. And it was only really the first Gulf War, when Saudi Arabia was used as a base for American forces, that bin Laden broke both with the Saudi ruling class, his own ruling class, he was a very rich Saudi, and the American supporters.
Specifically, when you talk about 9/11, there were 3 reasons that bin Laden gave for launching the attack on 9/11. One was the continuing sanctions on Iraq, which were estimated to have killed 500,000 children in Iraq over the course of the years. The second thing that he said was the plight of the Palestinians, which is an ongoing question for nearly everybody in the Middle East, but also for people in Europe, in America and elsewhere. And then the final thing he said was that he objected to the presence of American troops on Saudi soil.
The US and Britain and most of Europe constantly delude themselves about their popularity around the world and their influence around the world. They do not realise that the wealth, the arrogance, the exploitation, the military adventures are deeply resented by an awful lot of people around the world. And whilst I absolutely think 9/11 was totally and completely wrong, it was a loss of civilian life, it was a terrible thing to do, the reaction ought to have been one of peace, take stock, policing action, police inquiries, all that kind of thing. It was a criminal act that took place.
Project for a New American Century is essentially, or was, a project for asserting American hegemony in a world where there was no countervailing power at all. The way they formulated it was that the whole world is now virtually capitalist, so we have no ideological enemies. However, American power has to remain the dominant power in the world, and how do we go about it?
When the second George Bush formed his administration at the start of 2001, that many people have been associated with this, like Richard Perle, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, were obviously emerging as leading figures in the administration. How they would have pursued this agenda had there not been the attacks of 9/11 is an unknowable historical question, unanswerable historical question, but what we can be sure they would have done something.
Well, it wasn't automatic that there would be an attack on Afghanistan. There was a debate within the Bush administration, and some people, like Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, the real hawks inside the administration, wanted to go straight to an attack on Iraq. But Colin Powell, who'd been Chief of Staff in the first Gulf War, and was now a senior figure in the Bush administration, said, "Look, we can't do that. There is no connection between Iraq and 9/11. No Iraqis were involved in the attack on the Twin Towers. There's simply no connection. There's no Al-Qaeda in Iraq." One of the worst things about the Afghanistan war was it was an almost casual war by the United States. It was a war of convenience. It was a pit stop on the way to the much greater conflict in Iraq.
There was no one reason for the Afghanistan war. Yes, there was 9/11. Yes, there was a military assertion by the United States. Yes, there was a political feeling in the USA we've got to be seen to be doing something. But there was also a feeling that there's an awful lot of unexplored mineral resources in Afghanistan, going back to the time of the first Russian invasion in the 19th century when they were looking at it then.
I was active in the what was called the anti-globalisation movement, which was organising demonstrations and protests and all sorts of things against the kind of the general agenda of globalisation, against the kind of Bush worldview, really. Some of the energy, ideas, and some of the people actually who were involved in those protests at Genoa and Seattle and Nice and so forth, they came to see this, how important fighting against the war was, and so they got involved in the movement very early on.
The anti-globalization and anti-capitalist movement that arose after the Seattle demonstration in America in 1999. And that had been the birth of a whole different era of politics, really, of mass protest, of opposition to the system as a whole. In particular, the demonstration in the summer of 2001 in Genoa, which was a kind of a moment of transition where this mass movement was confronted with the Italian state, in which the demonstrator Carlo Giuliani was shot dead by the Italian police. That was one school which made us believe that such a movement over the war would be possible.
As a student, I was involved with the anti-apartheid movement. Because all political organisations were banned, we largely worked through what was called the MSA, or the Muslim Students Association, and through that, because it was a religious organisation, it couldn't be banned.
The early 80s, it was Greenham Common that I sort of cut my teeth on protests at, where we were trying to stop the cruise missiles that were coming to this country from arriving, and when they did arrive, against the wishes of all the people, we stayed until they've gone.
Very active in peace and anti-war movements, and first joined the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament when I was 15. I've been a member ever since.
I've been a campaigner against imperialist wars for a long, long time, almost 45 years. First against the Vietnam War, then against the wars in Central America, then against the wars against so-called terrorism.
There were three of us, all of us socialists, who decided we would have a small, well, it didn't particularly want it to be a small meeting. We had a meeting in a room for about 200 people at a friend's house, and that was absolutely packed and had a lot of people on the left came to it. We decided to launch from that a much bigger meeting in the big hall at friend's house the following Friday, just over a week later, so 10 days after the attacks themselves.
It's fine to have a left meeting about this, but if you're going to go up against the British state, allied to the American state, you better make sure that you've got the widest possible, the greatest possible numbers of people, the widest panoply of forces allied to you when you do it.
My friends and I had kind of set up an organisation called the City Circle, which was a young professional kind of Muslim organisation, just kind of attending very random things, trying to get a sense of where we could be most useful in vocalizing a Muslim voice that wasn't isolated in itself, but that belonged to the greater kind of body of British Muslim and other people.
We all knew the kind of priorities, the agenda of the Bush regime, and we all knew also by that stage already really that Blair was had signed up the Labour Party, the British government, to the globalisation agenda, to the kind of intervention. In fact, Blair to some extent had been up to that point leading the charge on interventions. We'd already thought that what was necessary was something very, very big and very, very broad, because I suppose as well as the fear of what the Americans were likely to do with British support, or the Western powers were likely to do, as well as that, I think there was at the back of our minds the fear of kind of, you know, reactionary, kind of the possibility of really reactionary feelings spreading amongst the population, the possibility of, you know, really nasty racism developing and kind of, you know, an anti-Muslim feeling.
Everybody had the same sense of urgency and the same sense of the fact that this event had changed the world as we know it, and that we were at the precipice of something quite momentous and it could go horribly wrong. We booked the hall and began ringing round George Monbiot and Jeremy Corbyn, Tariq Ali, Bruce Kent, Helen John from CND, the socialist solicitor Liz Davis, myself. We were the platform speakers, and Lindsay German was the chair of the meeting, and Chris Nyland was one of its main organisers.
Essentially, it was a meeting to try and orient the left and the anti-war movement and students and progressive people, saying, hey, this isn't a war you should be supporting.
Secret to it were, first of all, to move quickly, second, to kind of get the title right. And as I remember it, we were calling it Stop the War Before It Starts, which, you know, I think kind of encapsulated people's fears of what was likely to happen. And third, I think the important thing was to get a range of speakers, that the broadest possible range of good and relatively well-known speakers, so that people felt, okay, this is going to be you know, a wide kind of unity type meeting.
And this was before, certainly before Twitter and Facebook and all those kind of things. So we did it mainly through leafleting, word of mouth, getting it around to people. But it was obvious that people wanted to respond, and particularly the Muslim community, who instantly came under attack, you know, felt themselves under attack by discrimination in the streets, a small number of attacks on mosques, so they all felt they had to be there. Lots of people on the left obviously felt they had to be there, lots of peace campaigners.
The place absolutely heaving with people. I could have trouble getting in, struggled to get in the main hall for the platform there, and there was then rapid rechange of plans, and numbers of us were then sent all around the building to all the overflow meetings. And I spoke at all of those, then came back into the main hall, made my speech there, so it was like the third or fourth time that evening I'd made the same speech. And then they said, oh, there's a big crowd outside who couldn't get in the building. So I went out and climbed on the wall next to the bus stop and addressed the crowd out there, which was several hundred people, including people waiting for a bus who, well, they got an education. So they joined in as well. And so there was, I was so impressed and so pleased that so many people, obviously horrified at what had happened, but they could see, I think the words I used was the danger of letting slip the dogs of war, which are not going to be called back.
It was absolutely huge. We filled the hall, which is probably, we got 1,500 people in there. We filled an overflow, and then we still had something like 500 people outside on the pavement, and the speakers had to keep getting up and going out and speaking to the people outside. So all these impromptu meetings going on.
We knew this was in the air. I think everyone after Seattle knew that kind of re-emergence of a progressive, left-wing, vibrant kind of coalition-type politics was possible. You just had this kind of this energy and this obvious feeling that something had to be done. That, you know, politics was no longer a game, if it ever had been, but that really we were now entering a new period in history, is what it felt like, where really monumental events were taking place, and that therefore the left had to raise its game, by a whole lot really, and the great thing about that meeting was you felt, at it, coming away from it, you felt actually it may be possible to create something that is fit for purpose here, that is up to the challenge, up to the task.
It was an incredibly kind of adrenaline-filled time. You were just hoping to kind of get a coherent voice together.
And we knew then that firstly there was a very big seam of opinion in British politics which wasn't reflected in the media at all, wasn't reflected by government, which was against the proposed war.
We kept it very broad and very simple. We had 3 slogans: stop the war, obviously, and the other 2 sort of subsidiary slogans were the defence of civil liberties and opposition to any racist backlash, both of which, I have to say, turned out to be very prescient. So those were the only sort of things people had to sign up to. Within that framework, they could interpret the war in any way they wanted. I mean, whether you had a sort of liberal view, a pacifist view, an anti-imperialist view, a socialist view, or any or all of these, that was all fine.
Stop the War, or the incredible movement that was built by very ordinary people like you and I, who just felt that something needed to be done, and that we all have that incredible power within us to rise to a challenge and to change things.
Obviously our demonstrations became centrally important and in a way almost sort of iconic, but it shouldn't overlook the fact there's a lot of other work that goes on to turn around public opinion, to win a view that there has to be an alternative. That's work done in the communities, in workplaces. There was then a follow-up meeting organised to organise the Stop the War Coalition. That was held, I think, about a week later. But at the end, it constituted a committee, and I was put on the committee as representing the train drivers' union.
It was very important because it gave a signal that this wasn't just a bunch of lefties or a bunch of peaceniks or all the other ideas that people have about these campaigns, but that it was sections of the trade union movement getting involved, and other sections quickly got involved. For example, unions like the NUJ and the PCS.
You began to feel, and this was a feeling that I think came that we held right through the next few years, is that we were involved in something now that did have the possibility of making a real difference on fundamental questions to the world. And that was quite a new, to be honest with you, that was quite a new feeling for people on the left at the time.
Al-Qaeda is wounded, not destroyed. The scattered cells of the terrorist network still operate in many nations, and we know from daily intelligence that they continue to plot.
There is no such thing as a war on terror. Never was, never will be. This was just a neat phrase designed to scare people. That was its aim. People, by the time this is shown 10 years later, people will have forgotten how fear was created by the Labour government. Army tanks outside Heathrow Airport. It was designed deliberately to frighten people. Just like that, within 45 minutes, there could be terrorist attacks on Britain from Iraqis or from bases in Cyprus.
Well, it's a war against a sort of method, or a method of political action. Conceptually, a war on terror is nonsensical in that sense. You could say war is terror as well. So it's really been misnamed. And I think most people in Stop the War would see the war as a reassertion of sort of traditional imperialist power politics, of course in a different context in the 21st century to the sort of 19th century or the first half of the 20th. But nevertheless an attempt by the great powers led by the United States to secure their own domination over the world, its peoples and its resources. And the actual war on terror is a nonsense. If it's taken seriously, it's been spectacularly unsuccessful, as the terrorism has, by most measures, the threat of it has been enhanced by this war. and by the additional grievances it has given rise to and bloodshed it has caused.
If it were a clash of civilizations, the Americans wouldn't be in alliance with the Saudi ruling class, who are every bit as fundamentalist, in fact the most fundamentalist Muslim country. They would be as opposed to it as they are to Osman bin Laden. The truth of the matter is that the clash of civilizations only applies to those Muslims who are deemed to be enemies of the United States, and it doesn't apply to those Muslims who hold identical religious beliefs, who are allies of the United States. So that thesis was bogus from the beginning.
I mean, what had Iraq to do with the terror of 9/11? Nothing. Yet the American government said Saddam Hussein had links with Al-Qaeda, and the whole world laughed at them. So it became a convenient catch-all to push through new extradition laws, one of which is the law under which Julian Assange is being prosecuted, to push through the Patriot Act in the United States, to push through laws, anti-terror laws in the British Parliament, whereby we have a situation where there are people locked up for years without trial. When the South African apartheid regime used to keep people for 90 days without trial, there used to be an outcry all over the world. And because it's happening in Britain, and the British judiciary and the British legal system tolerates it, and the media is complicit in it, no one says anything because of the bogey of terror and the bogey of Islam. The combination that has been created to scare people like, you know, as if they were little children.
Za mene je bio logor. To za mene ne postoji da je čaršija, nego to je bio logor.
Leže djeca na krevetu, ne mogu da ustanu. Ni od gladi, pa oborila glad.
3 sata je bilo kad je najavilo da će Srebrenica pasti.
Samo se okrenu i kaže, majka, ja ti ideš umro.
Zagrlio me, poljubio i kaže, čuvaj mi djecu. I tu smo se i rastali.
Odmah su nas počeli zvati i sali, vezali nam oči na streljanje.
Mi smo pobjedni, što nam je drugo ime.
Boli me to što smo imali samo minut, 2 da se pozdravimo s njima.
Teško. Pogubiš sve, nemaš nikoga.
أغيب وذو اللطائف لا يغيب أغيب وذو اللطائف لا يغيب.
So I'm hoping that within the hour we'll be within Muzdalifah. The problem is then we haven't got a clue where we're going.
وأرجوه رجاء لا يخيب.
ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار.
أغيب وذو اللطائف لا يغيب وأرجوه رجاء لا يخيب وأسأله السلامة من زمان بليت به نوائبه تشيب.
The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You can find all these and many other subjects which are all of the very greatest interest in this wonderful DVD set of 10 documentaries. Everything you want to know about the life, livelihood, magnificent patience in the face of difficulties, and outward appearance of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is all in these documentaries. To order this 10-film DVD set that sets out the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, just call 0208 539 4885 or 44208 539 4885 from outside the UK, The whole set costs only £30 plus shipping charges. Lose no time over obtaining your copies of these wonderful documentaries. Order now. We will ship direct to your address.
Children in rural areas are getting ready for a big event. 5,000 children reading the Quran simultaneously on the world platform. Be part of this record-breaking event by sponsoring a child for just £100. The Big Read Hat-Trick, breaking 3 world records in one spectacular day, putting the world's poorest on a global stage. For more information, visit thebigreadhattrick.org.
Islamic Magazine is a fresh, new, free Muslim lifestyle magazine committed to publishing uplifting and enlightening material for our community. With a team of ulama regularly contributing, you can expect our articles to be authentic and in light of the Quran and Sunnah. Islamic Magazine also contains diverse inputs by talented feature writers on a wide range of topics to inspire your life as a Muslim. So pick up your free copy at selected mosques or visit islamicmagazine.com. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
They don't have a mother to love them, nor do they have a father for guidance. Let us love and care for them as if they're someone's children, just like our own. Join Junaid Jamshed on his UK tour, accompanied by Amjad Hussain and myself, as we'll be coming to Cardiff, Nottingham, Slough, Blackburn and London in aid of these orphans around the world. Come and make a difference.
The signs from the moon to the stars in the sky. I grew up, like a lot of these youth we see nowadays, very confused as to my identity. Was I African? Was I black? Was I Muslim? What type of person was I? They say that I came from slaves, as though being a slave is something that would make me ashamed. Hip-hop became like a religion for me, and I completely just forgot about my Islam.
What I think about the Taliban, it's America's tool. They recruited and funded and armed the Taliban, and the majority of Muslim people never supported them, never will support them. And again, it's Uncle Sam and co that are responsible for the Taliban.
Islam is all about al-mizan, or the balance. Any fanaticism is never it's never going to work. It's never going to be a reflection of what true faith is about, or what my belief of Islam is about. People lived in fear, and that could never be a just or fair system. And at the center of Islam, there's always justice and fairness. And if a system doesn't guarantee that, then how can it be Islamic?
It seemed to me that this idea that, you know, we'll get rid of the Taliban, we'll capture bin Laden, we'll do all this kind of thing, what it actually amounted to was waging war on one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the least developed countries in the world. And I think what we've seen, if you look, as we can now do with hindsight, actually getting rid of the Taliban did absolutely nothing to improve the lives of most people in Afghanistan. And 10 years later, they've come back with much, much more strength.
I was a total critic of the Taliban. I did not like the regime. I did not like its way of functioning. I didn't like the measures they were carrying out. I didn't believe that this regime had the support of the majority of people in Afghanistan. So I had absolutely no time for that regime, but I believed that the war was wrong nonetheless. And when one is opposing imperialist wars, the character of the regime that imperialism is fighting or using as a pretext to occupy the country shouldn't matter.
After the West got involved in opposing the Soviet support for the Najibullah regime, and that then very rapidly turned into a civil war. I think it was a huge mistake by his regime, by the way, to bring the Soviet Union in. The country then became a war ground. The Mujahideen were funded by the United States, and that then developed into the more specifically sectarian organizations. Finally, the Taliban win, in quotes, and gain control of the whole country. They did gain control. They were a functioning organization, and there were negotiations going on with them, which clearly the US had not the slightest interest in. They just wanted a war, and that's what they got.
The Taliban offered to give up bin Laden, and that offer was simply swept aside by the American administration. They weren't interested because they had other purposes in conducting the war.
This whole argument about women being liberated by George Bush was an absolutely disgusting way of really trying to harness the sympathies that people have, you know, the liberal, left-wing, feminist sympathies that people have about women should be equal. It was a disgusting way of using that in order to justify war.
The war blatantly was there because there was greed and there was hunger for power and control of the region. If you want to liberate women, you know, don't point a gun at them.
How do you bring about women's liberation in a country like Afghanistan, where you have to allow the women themselves to begin to develop their own ideas of doing it? You can't possibly do it from the West. And of course that assumes that there aren't any feminists in Afghanistan, or there aren't women who can think for themselves, and that really is the kind of colonial mentality which they all adopted.
Now I find it quite ironic that Obama, Cameron, all of them say, well, any future in Afghanistan has to involve the Taliban or elements of the Taliban in a settlement, and that President Karzai, can you kindly step aside while we get on with doing that?
Well, that was a demonstration that had already been organised. There had been a demonstration organised by CND on part of their campaign against nuclear weapons, and there's another demonstration that had been organised by Palestine Solidarity, and obviously in solidarity with the Palestinians facing Israeli occupation. And the two got sort of brought together. So it wasn't actually organised by Stop the War, and it wasn't actually supposedly about the war in Afghanistan. However, the war in Afghanistan having begun, and the sort of people who were involved in both CND and Palestine Solidarity, it very quickly became a first opportunity for people to express their opposition to the war in Afghanistan. And it was a big turnout. There was a noticeable turnout of British Muslims on the demonstration. And that, again, like the first meeting at Friend's house, was an indication that there was a sort of mood here of opposition to the war, which perhaps the government had not anticipated at all.
I remember a reporter coming up to me at the end of it, somebody from the BBC, and saying, we know this isn't your demonstration, but there are so many Stop the War placards on this demonstration, and there's so many. And it was a decent-sized demonstration. I don't know, I can't remember what the official figure for it was, but I think it was about 20 or 30,000. It was quite big at such short notice.
I remember getting up on the stage on the plinth in Trafalgar Square with John Rees and the other people there, and just seeing, you know, what a massive crowd it was, and what the energy and the anger that there was there. But I also remember we gave a note to the chair, who was the chair of CND at the time, to read out about the fact that we called another demonstration in, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks' time, and she read it out. And the roar that came out of the crowd when she said there's going to be another demonstration against the war in Afghanistan, we were like, whoa. And we knew at that moment that this was going to be something, you know, something really unprecedented.
in November. That was the first rally that I chaired as chair of Stop the War. It was considerably bigger than the one in October. This time the Muslim participation was sort of, if you like, more than just noticeable. I mean, it was a very big and powerful part of the demonstration.
I was invited up to speak at the time and to signify the fact that this was a special time of month for us. It was actually Asad Rahman, who is a campaigner with at that time Amnesty, suggested that we have a communal fast breaking and that people would fast in solidarity with us to show their kind of empathy with the Muslim community. It was an incredibly moving experience because we had Adhan, or the call to prayer, you know, across Trafalgar Square, from the plinths of Trafalgar Square. And there was an incredible sense of unity, which was, you know, you had to be there to feel it. It was palpable. At that time, you know, I remember quoting the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that said that there are people that fast and they get nothing from their fast but thirst and hunger. But this fast was more than that. You know, it really did feel like all of those people were elevated to a different level of consciousness with that kind of gesture.
People shared the dates with non-Muslims and the water with non-Muslims as well. And I think people found it a very moving experience. And I think it was an example of how you could make a demonstration much more habitable.
It's also striking that actually the war at one level had finished. The Taliban government in Kabul had collapsed and the Northern Alliance, with heavy US military support, was overrunning Afghanistan. So it seemed like perhaps there was nothing more really to demonstrate about. But the fact is that people came out, I think, for two reasons. One, they felt they still ought to protest against what the government had been doing, our government's involvement in this war, which still didn't seem to have been right. And secondly, an altogether too well-founded fear that this wouldn't be the end of it, and that the George Bush administration would be looking to extend the war elsewhere.
Huge, growing, a lot of young people turned up, and a whole lot of people sort of asking questions, saying, why are we at war? Why is this a war against Islamic people? Because that's what they interpreted it as. Why are we having these attacks on our civil liberties? And you could see then this was a fast-growing movement.
It was an incredible demonstration, partly because of its size. I mean, I don't think we've had a demonstration of that kind of scale, certainly since the poll tax demonstration, you know, 10 years before. And it was so diverse. I mean, to have all the Muslims on it, to have the trade union banners, sections of the Labour Party on it, and just ordinary people who'd come up from villages and towns across the country and had made their own banners and all this, and you suddenly think, oh my God, this is an absolutely mass campaign that is going way, way beyond the left, that really does have tremendous potential. So I mean, it was a deeply, deeply inspirational day.
There were people, if you like, Zionist academics and, you know, pro-Israel academics in USA and Israel itself, who were sort of warning this is a bad thing, that the left and the Muslims seem to be sort of hooking up against us in London. Something I'm proud to say we've done ever since.
What Just Peace was really the Muslim contingent within that body. So in essence, Just Peace was the Muslim voice within the Stop the War Coalition. And the reason we kind of set up a different group or a subgroup to Stop the War was just so that Muslims who were sort of, some parts of the Muslim community were rather insular, would not feel totally alienated by the concept of kind of joining a mass movement, which they may not readily have identified with. And so what Just Peace did was try and give a Muslim face to the Stop the War Coalition and to try and couch it within the kind of, or frame it within the Islamic worldview, and make it more palatable to the Muslim kind of community, but in no way kind of, you know, taking away from the aims of the Stop the War Coalition?
I've been involved in peace activities all my life. Stop the War Coalition from the very start was completely different. It was a combination of, yes, left political activists of lots of persuasions, Socialist Workers' Party, Labour Party, Plaid Cymru, Greens, etc. It was all of that. But it was also an outpouring by young Muslims in Britain. Combination of Stop the War Coalition, CND, the Muslim community as a whole was a very, very powerful combination. But it must also be said that at every rally we had speakers from Christian traditions. We also had Jews for Justice for Palestine speaking at most of them, because we were very keen to present a united front against war, irrespective of whatever faith people followed.
The war was being waged partly in the name of defending the Muslim people against the Taliban and so on and so forth. It was like this rhetoric of bringing democracy to Afghanistan and, you know, getting rid of the extremists and stuff. The fact that the Muslim communities turned out kind of put the lie to all this rhetoric for a lot of people, and that I think was a devastating blow. It kind of, and it gave those of us who were involved in organising the demonstration massive confidence, because, you know, if people who probably have, some of whom have family in Afghanistan, and they know the situation there very well, if they get prepared to come out and demonstrate, then, you know, we must be right. Not that we were in any doubt.
We didn't cause that. There was a reaction in the Muslim community, but what we did was to facilitate that being part of a unified movement as a whole. The reaction would have taken place whatever we'd done. The united movement would not have taken place whatever we'd done.
There was a lot of kind of persuading. And I think that kind of worked on both sides. I think the secular movements had to kind of get to know us and trust us as well, in that we were not trying to push, you know, an Islamic viewpoint onto them and kind of get that propagated. But and on the other side, we had the Muslim community, who we kind of had to win their trust as well. And so, kind of getting that balance right was quite tricky. But what I'd like to say is that we were surprised at how much support we got from both sides, from the Muslim community and from secular organisations, and what an incredible amount of goodwill there was to try and work together for peace.
It threw the establishment way off. You know, they really didn't know what had hit them with that, because I think that was very unexpected. You know, they work hard to keep the Muslim community separate from the rest of society, let alone from the left. I think it really brought home to us that this wasn't going to be a kind of left-wing, relatively small campaign, like, for example, the campaign against the Iraq War in 1991. This was going to be something different. This was going to be on a different scale with different dynamics. And that was also very important, because it kind of unleashed everyone's imagination and sense of creativity, I think, about the movement.
I constantly ask myself the question why we couldn't stop the wars. The power of government set on a particular direction is very hard to stop. Every society has a rush to the colours when the military are involved, and very few people want to be seen to be critical of their own armed forces.
You're facing an uphill battle when both the government and the opposition both support a war.
We need a different approach to the subject, and we have to concentrate on the arms industry that we have. It isn't just about attending meetings, holding mass movement demonstrations. It's about going to the places where the actual problem is, and they're at the bases. They're not in London, they're not in Hyde Park.
2 points that are very, very important here. The first is, I mean, really, there's a kind of factual problem, there's a historical problem with this criticism, which is that actually Stop the War, along with lots of other groups in the anti-war movement, organised some of the biggest, most effective, most radical direct action that Britain has ever seen. Interspersed between the demonstrations, we had all sorts of events. We blocked up Whitehall on Halloween one year. We had sit-down protests in towns and cities across the country. The front page of The Guardian, actually, 2 days before the war on Iraq started, actually quoted Lindsey German from Stop the War, calling on people from across the country to bring Britain to a standstill.
Political demonstrations have been part of the armoury of the left since the English Revolution in the 1640s, through the Chartists to the suffragettes. They are going to be part, they are a legitimate part, an important part of mobilising mass opinion. They're not the only tactic. And on occasions where it can be done, strike action or more militant forms of action are appropriate. But usually what happens with the more militant forms of action is there's a self-selecting group of people who will be by definition smaller than the mass of the population that will participate in a big demonstration. So you have to judge whether you want a kind of publicity stunt, which is what a direct action effectively is, and can be effective, or whether you want mass participation. It never bores me when millions of working people take the time out of their lives, take time away from jobs or family to participate in a political movement. That is the really radical thing to do, is to engage hundreds of thousands of people in political activity.
The reason the anti-war movement couldn't stop them, we were not strong enough. You know, either you bring 1 million people out each day, or you have a general strike to close the country down. There's no third way to stop a war.
All sections of the British establishment regard the so-called special relationship as being completely sacrosanct. What you'd be talking about would have been breaking the US as the world superpower.
I personally never thought it was going to be the case that it would be like a pantomime, that, you know, we'd rush on from one side of the stage waving the Stop the War placard and the bad people in top hats would run off twirling their black moustaches on the other. I always thought it would be a longer struggle.
War never has any winners. It only has degrees of loss. The losers, the people in Afghanistan. The losers, those that die. The losers, the soldiers from both sides that die. The losers, those whose services are cut to pay for an expensive military operations.
We're being told we can't afford libraries and schools and all these kind of things, but there's always a contingency fund for any old bit of bombing and war they want to carry out.
Anyone with any rational thought would say, we live in a world, the population's rising, 1 in 6 of the population of the world are not eating properly, many of them are literally starving to death, AIDS pandemic getting worse in some places, the gap between rich and poor getting worse. What do? Have a war. Have lots of wars. Have lots of invasions. Sorry, the only way forward for a peaceful world is sharing resources, is sharing the misery of people, is actually looking to conquer poverty. And you don't conquer poverty by war, you don't conquer poverty by making a small number of people very rich.
What was so bad about both of those wars was that we always said before them, they will not do what you say they're going to do. I mean, even if you took the politicians and the military and all these people at face value, they say they're going to bring democracy, civilization, women's liberation. We said none of these things will be achieved. War cannot achieve these things. Only people themselves can do that.
The wars that have been unleashed by the Western powers in the last 10 years have been an outrage against humanity. They've been a kind of obscenity, really, and an obscenity that's kind of largely disregarded or downplayed by the media and by, unfortunately, most of the people in Parliament and by the establishment generally. They're committing these atrocities, but they're also sort of covering them up in the most despicable way. And I think the idea that these things can be done apparently in our name, despite the fact that the majority of people in Britain are against them, is just too much to stomach. And I think that being able to mobilise tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands and even millions of people in the streets against them, it's like a kind of moral imperative, really. You feel as if we cannot allow these things to continue.
Our history is one of struggle. Parliament wasn't given to us, Parliament was won. The National Health Service wasn't given to us, it was won. The welfare state wasn't given to us, it was won. Every right, every freedom, every service we enjoy was a struggle to get it. Our society is one where our children are taught that all our benefits and all our gifts come from above. Nonsense. The reality is everything comes from underneath and everything comes from protest.
Our struggle in Stop the War was over the war. The scale of the struggle, the effect of that struggle on other areas, the confidence that it gave people that if they mobilised and fought back they could be effective, I think has lifted the bar for all the movements that came after, has fed into all the movements that came after, and has fed into the governmental crisis of all the Prime Ministers that have come after Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron.
I am very sure that all these things have built and have been cumulative and raising a consciousness within people about the fact that these systems are fallible and they cannot, they have no longevity in them.
When you march, you bring people with you. When you march, you give others a space and opportunity. And what the Stop the War Coalition did was gave us space to hundreds and thousands of young people who suddenly realised they could do something, they could say something, they could oppose this thing.
There's so many points in your life when you think you don't want to look back and regret things. You want to say, I was there and I was there to be counted.
Millions of people like my family are ordinary working people, you know, who work in hospitals or supermarkets, who take the time off, who aren't used to doing this. When they march, that's when you've got a game-changing political movement.
That's what protest does. It sparks something which might be dormant for a while, but it'll come up again somewhere else.